blind, have low vision, or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello and good evening. This is Don Swans, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the February 15th issue of the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Front page. Top of the page, a picture of 3 German army generals. And the headline, "The clock is ticking." The next question is, could Russia launch a war against Europe? It's by Gordy Fairclough, a regular contributor to the review. The dateline is Klaipėda, Lithuania. Germany's top military officer, General Carsten Breuer, stood astride a map of Lithuania laid out on the floor of a makeshift command post in this port city on the Baltic Sea. A chill rain beat against the windows as Breuer and his aides reviewed plans to surge ammunition and fuel to an armored brigade positioned in the likely path of any Russian ground attack on NATO. We need to train where and how we will fight, Breuer told the camouflage-clad soldiers gathered around him. We need to be agile. We need a new mindset. Breuer is racing to prepare Germany's armed forces for war. And for the 61-year-old veteran of conflicts from Kosovo to Afghanistan, the clock is ticking. Germany's military intelligence agency estimates that within the next 3 years, Russia, whose armies poured into Ukraine in 2022, will have amassed enough weaponry and trained enough troops to be able to start a wider war across Europe. Breuer says a smaller attack could come at any time. We have to be ready, he says. To that end, Breuer has been waging a multi-front campaign to rally Germany's politicians, business people, soldiers, and the general public behind efforts to speed the nation's rearmament and persuade them that they must be prepared to fight Russia to preserve their democratic freedoms. Defense spending has climbed sharply. And Parliament in December passed a law that will require young men to undergo medical exams to assess their fitness to military purpose. The aim is to spur voluntary enlistment. Conscription could be next, and the government says if the Army doesn't get enough recruits. All of this has put Breuer in the vanguard of European generals and national security officials working to rebuild the continent's militaries. Weakened by years of threadbare budgets after the demise of the Soviet Union. On Thursday, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius nominated Breuer to serve as the next chair of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's Military Committee. If chosen, he would become principal advisor to the alliance's Secretary General. Complicating matters is the fact that under the Trump administration, the U.S., for decades Germany's and Western Europe's most important ally, is increasingly seen as, at best, an unreliable partner, and at worst, a hostile force undermining the continent's security. European officials say they need to be prepared to go it alone in the event of war with Russia, a conflict that would define the future of the democratic West. In Germany, the European Union's largest economy and most populous country, is absolutely central to the continent's defense. Ironically, a powerful German military, the bane of Europe in the first half of the 20th century, is now essential to its security in the 21st. The word Kriegstag is the German word for war ready. Brewer has made this his rallying cry as he drives change in the armed forces and tries to jolt Germans from their post-Cold War end-of-history reverie. He and Defense Minister Pistorius deliberately use the term, which carries extra weight in German. Unlike in American English usage, where war is waged on everything from drugs to poverty, the Germans reserve Krieg, or armies fighting armies. And it plucks a nerve in a country still scarred by its history of militarism. Brewer joined the Army in 1984, at a time when the military war was near its post-World War II peak in terms of troops enough and readiness, with around 500,000 men under arms and roughly 2,000 main battle tanks. At that time, it was the mainstay of NATO's conventional forces in Central Europe. When the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed, the need for a large standing army seemed like a thing of the past. German soldiers still fought, including in Afghanistan, where they were part of a NATO-led stabilization force. But military budgets shrank and money was spent on reunification. By the 2010s, the military was less than half its Cold War size, and much of its weaponry and equipment were in disrepair. Over time, Brewer says, the country that was home to Clausewitz and von Moltke ended up with few people thinking about grand strategy. Brewer was part of a generation of officers whose mission was often to make do with less, focusing on downsizing and making things more efficient, not more effective. His job now is to change that. Brewer's evangelizing has made him an important public figure in a country unaccustomed to seeing and hearing from men in uniform. On TV, at town halls, and universities, the bespectacled officer with close-cropped gray hair and an almost professional demeanor lays out the stakes for his countrymen. His message is reasoned, calm, and direct. He ticks through a list. Russia's economy is on a war footing. The country is stockpiling artillery shells and tanks. It's looking to expand its ranks to 1.5 million men. We need to be very focused on deterring and defending against Russia. That means contending with German society's deeply ingrained pacifism, a legacy of ruinous wars and the horrors of the Holocaust. When the German army was reconstituted in the 1950s, firmly under NATO control, soldiers were taught to be citizens in uniform and to be fiercely protective of democratic institutions. They were schooled in domestic and international law. Brewer's formal title is Inspector General. What makes him sound more like an auditor than a warrior, even though he's the equivalent of the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The building where he works in Berlin is also the site of a memorial to German officers executed for plotting against Adolf Hitler. Looking down into the atrium outside his office, you see a large carpet woven to look like an aerial photograph of bomb-ravaged Berlin at the end of World War II. It is our duty, he says, to make sure this never happens again. Claudia Major, a political scientist and specialist on German security policy, says Brewer is the perfect messenger because of his thoughtful and deliberate manner. He manages to explain the dangers to the public without causing panic, but also without pretending things are lovely and nice. He doesn't freak people out, says Major. Attitudes have shifted considerably since Russia seized the Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 and then in 2022 launched a large-scale invasion which Germany's chancellor at the time, Olaf Scholz, called an epical shift. In 2025, about two-thirds of Germans saw Russia's military as a threat, according to a Defense Ministry survey. The survey also found that 64% of Germans think defense spending should be increased, compared with 57% in 2024. Another 65% think Germany should have larger armed forces, up from 58%. Meanwhile, the perception of the U.S. as a dependable ally dropped sharply to 37% in 2025, from 65% a year earlier. In another landmark, Germany is stationing an armored brigade in Lithuania. The first German troops and tanks to be permanently based abroad since World War II. The 45th Panzer Brigade's 5,000 men should all be deployed by the end of next year. Already, German tanks and armored personnel carriers, emblazoned with the military's black Iron Cross insignia, are training in Lithuania's Rudenkai forest close to the border with Belarus, which is Russia's closest ally. Europe, in Brewer's view, is now in a liminal state, not yet at war, but no longer at peace. Governments are contending with near-daily drone intrusions, cyber attacks, and an intensifying campaign of sabotage against railways, communications, cables, and other targets, all of which they blame on Moscow. The week Brewer visited the German troops exercising in Lithuania, more than a dozen Russian drones violated the airspace of neighboring Poland. NATO fighters were scrambled to shoot them down, and Brewer had to interrupt his trip for urgent consultations about reinforcing the alliance's eastern flank. Meanwhile, across the border in Belarus, thousands of Russian soldiers were conducting maneuvers alongside their Belarus counterparts. That included planning for the joint use of nuclear weapons. We are being tested, Brewer says. They are looking for ways. We are vulnerable. The war in Ukraine, now about to enter its fifth year, is a daily reminder of the menace to the east. On a recent visit, Brewer saw a long convoy of military ambulances carrying wounded men back from the battlefield. It always comes down to the soldier on the front lines. They do our fighting. Brewer's focus on fighting men and women is guiding his sweeping remake of the German military. His task is to lead a pivot back to a military capable of waging and winning large-scale conventional war. The goal is to field 3 fully equipped combat divisions by 2032. Brewer and his aides are working with German defense companies to speed weapons manufacturing. We need to speed up and shorten the innovation cycle. Pointing to the situation in Ukraine, where frontline units and manufacturers collaborate to improve weapons on the fly. Frustrated with the pace of change, last year Brewer started to give money directly to battalion and brigade commanders so they can buy off-the-shelf commercial drones and other equipment so they can experiment. In the future, Brewer predicts every rifleman will need to be a drone pilot. Lieutenant Colonel Tobias Tidau, a German officer who until recently led NATO's multinational battle group in Lithuania, says units in the field are already benefiting with new command and control and battle management systems. And he has been buying drones so his men can train with them. We are adapting to a new kind of warfare, Tidau says. You need to give officers the flexibility to push that through. Brewer has also quickly assembled drone defense teams of 30 to 35 personnel equipped with jammers, radar, and counter-drone drones. In early November, when there were drone excursions in Belgium, the defense minister requested help. Brewer sent a team that day, and it was operational the next day. A unit was also sent to Denmark. That is huge, to have action and fast. That is a big change, says Rob Barr, a Dutch admiral, now retired, who was chair of the NATO Military Committee from 21 to 25. If you're able to organize something like that in a day, that's something. The German armed forces were big, but not ready. He's working on that. Another challenge is filling the ranks. The military now numbers about 184,000 men. Brewer is aiming to add another 20,000 men this year and then another roughly 60,000 more by 2035. That force will be supplemented by 200,000 reservists. Parliament has approved a law that requires all men aged 18 to complete a military service questionnaire. Starting in 2027, they'll be expected to undergo physical exams to determine whether they are fit to join. The hope is that this will prompt more people to volunteer to serve. If the military still falls short of its manpower needs, politicians say they may resort to compulsory military service, which was suspended in 2011. Brewer speaks regularly to young Germans. They're one of the toughest groups to persuade that the Russian threat is real, that German society needs to mobilize, and that they need to be prepared for military service. It's a tough sell in a country where pacifism is a deeply ingrained civic value. Young opinions are in flux. A 2025 Ipsos poll conducted for the military found that 42% of Germans aged 16 to 29 supported new military service requirements. Another survey found 59% said they probably or definitely would take up arms to defend their country. At an appearance at the University of Mannheim in southwest Germany, Brewer in his gray jacket, his dress uniform, sprang from his chair, transforming what had been an avuncular presence into one of studied intensity. Brewer asked the audience, "Can we fight a war?" And they responded with surprised laughter. "Are you ready for war?" he said, pointing to a young woman seated near the stage. "Does the question disturb you?" He continued in a series of staccato questions. What would it be like if Germany was at war? Brewer told the students that strength was the way to maintain peace. We have to make sure that we in Germany are not vulnerable, that we can't be attacked, and that a possible aggressor knows an attack is not worth it. During the question and answer period, one student said, "In the end, war only leads to people dying," and asked whether all the money now being devoted to defense would be better used to promote democracy or other initiatives in Russia. If peace is achievable, we must do everything to attain it, Brewer responded. But he cautioned that years of engagement with Russia and Berlin's commitment to a change through trade policy had failed to keep the Kremlin on a peaceful and democratic path. Then there's the biggest challenge, contending with the strains now racking the transatlantic alliance. The Trump administration has criticized allies, cut back on aid to Ukraine, and expressed an openness to improving relations with Russia and its autocratic leader, Vladimir Putin. So far, Brewer says, military-to-military relations remain strong, and NATO, under its American commander, continues to operate as usual, parrying Russian threats. There's a lot of trust among soldiers. Every one of us sees the value in these relationships. Brewer was studying at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas on September 11, 2001, when al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked planes and used them to attack New York and Washington. He says it was a seminal moment in his life, and one that set the course for decades of his military career as Germany joined the U.S. in its global war on terror. Meanwhile, behind the military's Berlin headquarters building, there's a memorial to the more than 3,000 military and civilian members of the German armed forces who have lost their lives in the line of duty. 59 of the dead were killed in Afghanistan. When I need a moment for myself, when there are really hard decisions, I like to go there to get my head straight, Brewer says. In the end, you see why you are doing this. For a stable and bright future for all Germans. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Looking at things a different way, let's take a look at this next article, entitled Inside Saudi Arabia's Budding Dating Scene. It's written by Omar Abdelbaki, a regular contributor, and it further states in the subheadline, liberalization has opened the door to more casual relationships, but society is still catching up. Swiping through Tinder in Saudi Arabia, a profile of a woman in her mid-20s includes photos of her manicured hands holding flowers, a matcha latte, a tennis court, and some art. She reveals no photos of herself. Looking for a partner who can play sports, her biography reads. And if you're looking for a fun and short relationship, swipe left. Another profile of a woman in her early 20s obscures her face with emojis or her phone blocking view. She features photos from her point of view. Reading in a cafe, driving with a puppy in her lap, traveling around Istanbul. One man shares images with his face showing, wearing a tobe and headdress while holding a falcon on his arm, with other photos at the gym and pool. Another man includes only a hook emoji in his bio, a signal that he's looking for a hookup. It may seem like an unusually covert way to date in the eyes of many Americans, but young Saudis are navigating a burgeoning world of romance as the country's loosening of strict moral codes gives way to dating culture in bloom. Looking no further than the millions of people who download Tinder in Saudi Arabia over the past 5 years to understand how much the Islamic kingdom has relaxed its customs around courtship. It is a significant change from the days when most meetings between young people were carefully managed by marriage-focused relatives, and any form of premarital romantic relations was off limits. The top matchmaking apps in Saudi Arabia brought in nearly 16 million in net in-app revenue, according to Sensor Tower, a market intelligence firm. Downloads of the top dating apps in the country of around 35 million people have risen every year for half a decade, hitting 3.5 million in 2025. Some young people are now being more overt on their dating profiles, revealing their faces and personal details, including names, interests, and universities attended. Some post photos of themselves in traditional Saudi dress. For men, a thobe and headdress. For women, in abaya and headscarf. It is more common in some places to see mingling between men and women who weren't relatives, socializing that was anomalous a decade ago. Young Saudis, including one attending a desert rave in the neighboring United Arab Emirates, said their generation was still figuring out how to manage more casual interactions or find spouses outside the purview of parents. My generation in Saudi grew up secluded and in gender-segregated schools, said Tala Al-Afaj, a 23-year-old from Saudi Arabia's East Coast. People are still getting used to the concept of dating. While secret dating has long been a reality, the cost of getting caught by agents from Saudi's religious police, who once but no longer roamed the streets, turned young lovers away. Parents tended to arrange marriages, and Saudi society remains conservative about gender mixing, dating, and sex. Now, Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is nearly a decade into an ambitious modernizing project. His massive social and economic development plan, called Vision 2030, aims to brighten Saudi Arabia's global image, woo international tourists and high-skilled expats from the West, and wean the kingdom off its reliance on petrodollars. Since his appointment in 2017, Saudi Arabia has reined in its religious police, lifted a ban on women driving, allowed restaurants and cafes to desegregate by gender, and promoted cinema and musical events. In recent months, the kingdom has quietly loosened long-enforced restrictions of alcohol. Religious police once cracked down on the sale of love-themed items on Valentine's Day, including red roses and gifts meant for the celebration, which is named after a Christian saint. Now those items are freely exchanged between lovers, and luxury hotels are promoting romantic packages for the holiday. The changes have led to Saudis wooing one another at hip cafes in more liberal cities like Riyadh and Jeddah. They're getting to know each other online and at large events. Places to openly date are still limited. Unmarried lovers huddle in discreet, permissive cafes they find through word of mouth. Those in conservative circles have secret dates in cars with tinted windows. Women and gay users in the country feel the most stigma around dating, often obscuring their faces and leaving few identifying details or dating apps. Saudis in gay relationships said they got away with public dates, as two people of the same sex hanging out raises few suspicions. They, too, are using dating apps, subtly hinting at their sexual orientation by including their preferred pronouns in their bios. Some young Saudis say they still feel shame around dating, even as it becomes more ubiquitous. Men are sometimes reluctant to marry a woman they met on the dating scene because of the stigma. When you're secluded for way too long, you don't know the steps. You don't know how to properly get to know the other gender when it comes to dating, Al-Abar said. We are just now figuring it all out. Saudi Arabia's Sharia-based justice system still prohibits sex outside of marriage and homosexuality. While the kingdom appears to have eased up on punishment, judges could still sentence people to flogging, imprisonment, and even death for consensual sexual relations, according to rights groups. These social changes exist in a legal gray area, said Andrew Leber, assistant professor at Tulane University and a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Middle East program. The scope of what is tolerated is much greater than what is legally guaranteed. Some religious Saudis and members of the kingdom's diminished but still influential clerical class are concerned the crown prince is taking things too far. They don't want Saudi Arabia, which occupies a sensitive position as guardian of Islam's holiest sites, to end up like the United Arab Emirates, where alcohol flows freely, prostitution operates indiscreetly, and legal gambling is on its way. A top-down shifting from something quite restrictive is complex, said Philippe Thelman, Cambridge University anthropology researcher focused on social reform in Saudi Arabia. But the apps are surely part of the transition. Al-Afash said some conservative families have become more strict, taking up the slack as the state backs off its enforcement of social restrictions. Changes are happening so fast, and many people are afraid of it. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. More and more is being written about the kidnapping of Savannah Guthrie's mother, Nancy. A nightmare scenario reveals something deeper about aging parents, says Claire Ansbury. regular contributor. The Nancy Guthrie case, while a nightmare for one high-profile family, is striking a personal chord with millions of Americans. We all have aging relatives or friends and worry about something happening to them. Many live alone, hundreds of miles away. They may have lots of friends, golf 5 times a week, but are still 80 or 90 and likely to have chronic health conditions. What if they fall, get in an accident, have a stroke, get scammed? The Guthrie case adds another more horrific scenario. Older adults, too, are concerned in a broader sense. The unimaginable series of events, the middle of the night kidnapping of an 84-year-old woman, shows that awful things can happen. The billboards on Texas highways read, "Missing person," with her age and photo. All this highlights what many seniors and their concerned children know. Even if they are relatively healthy and active, they are vulnerable too. Yet most other adults want to live in their own home, alone or not. They value their independence. Their kids, on the other hand, especially as their parents grow older, value safety. The tension between kids and their parents have always been there, but scary things like the Guthrie case exacerbate it. It brings to light what scares us most about aging, that we're reaching a vulnerable stage, says Dr. Lou Aronson, a geriatrician and author. This past week, while getting her hair cut, Aronson said her stylist, who's about 60, began talking about the Guthrie case. The stylist said she always thought the thing to fear most about aging was dementia. Now she fears being abducted. Abductions are rare, but in the stylist's mind, they are no longer unimaginable. Feeding the fear. More than 16 million people aged 65 and older in the U.S. live alone. That represents 28% of that age group. Which is almost triple the share in 1950. Many are women. Among the reasons are increased longevity, higher divorce rates among older adults, and children who are more scattered than previous generations. And the older you get, the more likely you are to live alone. More than half of households with someone 75 and older consist of only one person. Living alone carries risks. Older adults on their own tend to have more accidents and neglect their health. Those who are lonely are often targeted by scammers who have become more sophisticated. Tina Satarangi is in the sandwich generation, with kids at home and aging relatives. She's also a geriatric nurse practitioner and has many other older patients who want to remain in their house. People want to preserve their independence as long as possible. They think, this can't happen to me, she says. That fact that there are people in the world who would attack an older, vulnerable person is really jarring. She wants people to stay at home as long as possible. but they may mean making modifications and agreeing to cameras and sensors, even if they don't like them. As we age, we have to understand our vulnerabilities and stop trying to ignore them. On a recent evening after finishing their bocce game, Julie Schoen talked with friends about Nancy Guthrie. The conversation moved from particular details of the case into artificial intelligence, tracking devices, and Oura rings. That's O-U-R-A. Her friends have parents in their late 80s and 90s, some living alone, and worry about them. A friend's mother was scammed out of $10,000. She called Schoen, past director of the National Center on Elder Abuse, for advice. The money was recovered. They are at the crossroads. Self-determination versus safety. When can you cross the line and take over, she says. One of the most unsettling things about the Guthrie case is that it adds another layer of uncertainty about our ability to control our lives. But the solution isn't having older parents leaving their homes when they spent decades of their lives and go live with someone else, says Laura Cartensen, director of the Stanford Center on Longevity. They try to talk older parents into moving, and their parents want to live where they want to live. Therein lies the tension. Carstensen knows. Her 97-year-old dad lived alone in a two-story house on the East Coast. He had balance issues and a heart condition. I would wake up and hope to have an email, she says. If not, she would call. He refused to have sensors installed throughout his home, but he did agree to put one on his refrigerator and one in his office. A biophysicist that was there, he spent his days writing papers. She checked those sensors every morning. Her dad, she says, would tell her that if he fell in the kitchen, hit his head, and died 2 days later, it wouldn't be the worst way to go. And that is exactly what happened. Carstensen was with him, as was her brother, when her dad died at home. While devastating at the time, Carstensen says she understands his desires and respects them. He got his wish in that sense. He lived life on his own terms. Weighing parents' wishes against children's worries is always fraught, and the Guthrie case adds to the stress. But it isn't likely to be the deciding factor in when and how older parents live. There is an internal struggle about how to balance someone's autonomy and safety, says Liz O'Donnell, the Boston-based founder of Working Daughter, an online community of caregivers. The Nancy Guthrie case has triggered some of those feelings in the community. But overall, our community is viewing this as a unique situation. We worry about falls and scams, not kidnapping, she says. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Jessica Tunkel is a regular contributor to the review. This week she presents for us a very interesting article. It's entitled, "My Doctors Blame My Itch on Perimenopause." It was cancer. 2 years, 11 doctors, and one diagnosis later, I've learned a lot about how medicine can miss women's symptoms. The itch crept up my back, across my stomach, and along my arms and legs. It flared during my morning runs and followed me to the office. It was particularly acute at night. I was covered in marks from unconscious bouts of scratching during the few short bursts of sleep I could steal. I looked and felt like a mauled animal. My doctor shrugged and said it was just what happened to middle-aged women. During perimenopause, the period of time that can last years before a woman's menstrual cycle ends, dropping estrogen levels can thin and dry skin, he said, and suggested I put lotion on before bed. Another doctor who ruled out allergies also said it must be perimenopause. She put me on a birth control pill. The itch continued. An intuitive wellness practitioner who said she was trained in nutrition, botanical medicine, and homeopathy promised to get to the root cause of my itching. She did not. A functional health doctor prescribed progesterone cream to help balance my hormones. Another tailored solution to women experiencing menopause. 2 years and 11 doctors later, I learned that my stubborn itch had nothing to do with menopause, perimenopause, or hormones. Simply put, I had cancer. I was diagnosed with stage 2 Hodgkin's lymphoma, a blood cancer for which a common symptom is a persistent itch. My doctors have been so focused on the most likely answer that they failed to dig deep enough to find the actual problem. And I didn't know how to ask them to probe further. For decades, the medical community viewed women as small men, which meant doctors didn't even acknowledge that we may exhibit distinctive symptoms of diseases, let alone consider how hormone levels play into our overall health. Middle-aged women who were suffering from depression were often prescribed antidepressants or anti-anxiety medicine without further discussion or exploration, said Dr. Anna Barbieri, an obstetrician, gynecologist, and certified menopause practitioner in New York City. The law did not mandate that women be included in medical clinical research until 1993. But the medical community's growing awareness of the implications of hormone fluctuations on women's health has, in some cases, mine included, created a new danger that doctors write off symptoms as hormonal when they could indicate more serious problems. Menopause is having a moment. The oldest millennials, the nation's biggest generation, and are entering their mid-40s and devouring a torrent of new supplements, lotions, pills, gels, books, and podcasts devoted to menopause relief. Women in the U.S. spend about $13 billion a year to treat their menopause symptoms, according to a 2024 survey by AARP. We're witnessing a massive pendulum swing of one type of ignorance to another, Barbieri said. I think we are way oversimplifying health here and worry that some women will not get treated for major conditions. In the 2 years I battled the itch, it blossomed from a nuisance to a constant presence in my life. I was willing to try anything to stop it. I tried 2 different biologic drugs, shots that required me to see an allergist every few weeks. On a work trip to France, a colleague brought me to a store to buy her favorite skin creams. I went on a wellness kick. I stopped eating gluten and dairy and forced down celery juice every morning. I tried supplements suggested by the functional health doctor, including ones labeled hormonal detox and the progesterone cream, one of the hormones that declines in women in middle age. Nothing worked. In the middle of covering Paramount's high-stakes merger with Skydance, I found myself rolling up my sleeves to itch my arm while talking to sources and my editors. Exhausted by the end of the day, I began turning down evening invitations from friends and colleagues. Likewise, not every itch is going to be a cancer diagnosis. I think the takeaways is if you don't get a satisfactory answer and it's something that has lasted for a long time, keep pushing. I completed 6 months of chemotherapy in September and am now in remission. My mysterious symptoms went away after 2 infusions, as my oncologist said they would. I'm lucky that I had a type of cancer that was highly treatable. Not all women are so lucky. Women, myself included, too often worry about coming off as hypochondriacs about pain or symptoms. So we just bear it without pressing for answers when our gut tells us the doctors are wrong. I had so many blood tests and procedures, but I never pushed for a CT scan. If I had, we could have caught it earlier. If you aren't feeling well, you need to continue to look for a doctor that will listen to you, said Dr. Carolyn Fierro, a New York-based gynecologist who specializes in functional and hormonal health. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from the most recent issue of the Wall Street Journal Review, to wit, February 15th. We read from the Wall Street Journal Review every Thursday at 7 p.m. And your reader this evening has been Don Swans. Thank you for listening. I truly mean that. Thank you. Good luck and God bless you. Good night now.
Coming up next on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the New York Times. Following that at 9 o'clock is Fortune Magazine. And at 10 o'clock, we have episode number 11 of Denied Access by Don Bentley with Vince Flynn. Stay with us for these readings and more. If you or people you know shop at any of the Dash's supermarkets, please save Dash's register tapes for radio reading. Our agency receives $2 for every $100 in Dash's register tapes. Radio reading has raised thousands of dollars so far. Anyone can drop off their Dashes tapes to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service at 1199 Harlem Road, Cheektowaga, between William and Clinton Streets. Or Dashes tapes can be mailed to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service at 11. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability